Alright, greetings everyone, and welcome to my continued series on Canadian history. The next two lectures are going to be looking at sort of Canada's relationship with itself, essentially. This lecture is going to be dealing with Canada's relationship with Quebec, and then kind of the second part to this one will deal with Canada's relationship to multiculturalism, how multiculturalism navigates itself within the family of Canada, and lastly, of course, but by no means least, Canada's relationship with First Nations. And in Canada we use the term First Nations to refer to our Indigenous peoples or Aboriginal peoples. But for today we're going to be looking specifically at Canada's relationship with Quebec, predominantly after the Second World War to the beginning of the 21st century. And I want to just say right away that I am coming from the position of sort of a Western Canadian from British Columbia. And it's not so much that I'm coming from that position. I'm very much aware of regional differences. I'm very much aware of the concept of Western alienation as has been used for people who feel left out in the West from the politics of Ottawa and out east. But I wanted to just share with you when I begin that as a young boy I was fascinated with Quebec as much as I was fascinated with the Arctic, with the North, with the Inuit peoples. A lot of that probably, well, I could say almost certainly had to do with my exposure to National Film Board vignettes that were on television when I was a child. And every now and again my teachers would show us little vignettes on the old reel-to-reel projectors that they'd roll in on a cart, and of course that was just an absolute moment of joy when you saw the teacher roll in that reel-to-reel projector and heard that clicking sound. But there were a couple things that I saw, and I remember seeing a documentary on how to make maple syrup, and there was one that was, I believe, a documentary on the Carnival, which I believe is an annual celebration in Quebec. And you know, I remember as a young person being intrigued by the fact that this was part of Canada. But to me, Quebec seemed as remote as Great Britain, France, Germany, and Russia. It was somewhere way over there, but there was still a part of me that recognized that it was part of our great country. I never felt any, you know, animosity or anything like that towards Quebec. It was sheer curiosity and fascination. And, you know, and certainly as a kid growing up on boxed cereal for breakfast, I remember very clearly reading, everything was, you know, French one side, flip it over, English the other. So I grew up with, while I didn't necessarily hear the French language, I saw it written, and I remember trying to pronounce words, and I remember recognizing the point at which the verbs seemed to be backwards from where the, you know, hot chocolate would be, you know, chocolate hot in French, and so on and so forth. So just little things like that as a young boy that really intrigued me. It's too easy from a Western perspective to kind of look at Quebec and say, oh, well, you know, Quebec does this and they want that and they always want this and so on and so forth. It's a naive sentiment. It is one that those kinds of sentiments are usually sentiments that are passed down from family members, or somebody says something in a conversation and you, for whatever reason, grab onto that point of view. Quebec's history is remarkable. We have to consider that Quebec was a completely thriving French colony for 150 years, even before the English came up here. That starting roughly in 1608, when Samuel de Champlain established Quebec, where he had come from Port Royal in Nova Scotia. It wasn't called Nova Scotia then, but he came up to Quebec because it was a perfect defensive position. And roughly from 1608 forward, we saw a gradual but steady increase in people moving into Quebec. Started out predominantly as a fur trading post, evolved into a thriving colony with industries. It became a royal colony in the 1660s, and by 1759, when the British came and conquered Quebec, Quebec, as I said, was a very, very well-developed, thriving French colony. So you have this very, very rich history. And, without going into too much details about the Loyalists, you'll have to look at my lectures that deal with the American Revolution and certainly the impact of the migration of close to 100,000 Loyalists fleeing the Revolution who came up to Canada by invitation of the British, who had basically just inherited this new colony of Quebec. From the time that Britain took over Quebec, there was always this uneasy peace. And I'll be perfectly honest that the British made some pretty remarkable attempts to make the French Canadians feel that, hey, look, we are in charge now, but we're not going to mess with your language. We're not going to mess with your church. It's business as usual. And those kinds of guarantees were established through things like the Quebec Act, or even the Constitutional Act and the Royal Proclamation. Despite the fact that French Canadians had been assurances that it's business as usual, as more British came into the now British colony of Quebec, who do you think the leaders of the colony, the British administration, are going to favor? If they have a French businessman or a British businessman who do the same thing, who's the government going to support? Right? You can see how things go. And I think from the point of conquest, the Plains of Abraham, 1759, to the present, Quebec has been understandably grappling with this sense of identity. We have a culture, we have an identity, we have our own church, we have our own language, and they have very, very passionately and rightfully held on to that. And at times that tug and pull is what leads to this interesting, fascinating tension between English Canada and French Canada. So anyway, let's go back. We're going to start roughly in the 1930s and look at the roots of Quebec nationalism. From 1936 to 1939, and again in 44 to 59, Quebec was controlled by Premier Maurice Duplessis and his party, the Union Nationale. Now I want to make one admission for French speakers who are watching this, may have already picked up on this. I do not have a French background. I absolutely love French history and French Canadian history, but my pronunciation may be negligible, so I apologize in advance. You can email me and correct me. Duplessis was a strong nationalist who was devoted to Quebec as a distinct society, and he introduced the fleur-de-lis as Quebec's flag. Very, very important symbol. Still very, very relevant in nationalist politics today, right there. The Roman Catholic Church was the main defender of Quebec culture, praising farm, faith, and family, and exerting tremendous influence in society through the control of schools and hospitals. Those who control the education systems of societies can exert a lot of influence. And I'm not suggesting that the Roman Catholic Church used the education system to brainwash people. It was nothing like that. But in saying that, it isn't unrealistic to suggest that naturally the primary interest of the Roman Catholic Church will be to defend their faith, defend their point of view, defend Catholicism, and they would do that, of course, through the education system. So, the Roman Catholic Church was very, very much entwined within French Canadian culture and history and society. So, very, very important piece. Duplessis encouraged foreign investment while keeping foreign culture out. Labor was cheap since Duplessis had banned most union activity. I mean, Maurice Duplessis was a staunch conservative, not so much in the political party sense, but in the ideological sense. He was fiercely anti-communist. And another time we'll look at a different lecture at something called the Padlock Laws. Unfortunately, labor really took a beating during the Cold War because it was through labor organizations that Western governments believed where communists would infiltrate, so to speak. And, as a result of this, you see a really punitive attitude towards labor organizations, and certainly in Quebec, union activity was banned, which is quite remarkable because in other parts of the country, union membership was thriving. So, you know, Quebec really very much had kind of its own world, its own thing happening there. The expectation from business was that they would give financial contributions to his party, resulting in corruption and bribery. Now, I think you can kind of see the fundamental problem with this. This is the fundamental problem in general in all Western democracies, where private organizations can give private donations to a political party of their choice. Excuse me. What impact do you think, if you are a very, very wealthy businessman and you are looking for easy access to markets, whatever we want to say, you give the party of your choice $1 million donation. Do you think they do that just for the kindness of their hearts, or do they expect something in return if they get voted into office? Okay, well there's your answer. You're already thinking it. So obviously this is the problem with private organizations giving political party donations, that there is a certain expectation of patronage of, well, okay, you do this, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. In Quebec at this time, it was pretty overt, and you know, even people in Quebec are getting a little upset, and you know, you got to consider Duplessis had been in power 3 years in the middle 30s, and then of course 15 years in the 40, 59. So he cast quite a long shadow, and I think that anybody who rules for that long, things get a little tired and a little old, and I think people were ready for something new. And as a result, a combination of the frustrations of certain limitations of Quebec under Duplessis, and also in combination with the fact that there was an emerging baby boom generation by the early mid-60s that was coming into voting age, we begin to see a real shift in values in Quebec. And that shift and those changes that occur is referred to as the Quiet Revolution. In 1960, after Duplessis died, Jean Lige and the Liberals came into power, moving to stamp out corruption, awarding jobs and contracts according to merit. What an interesting idea. Wages and pensions were raised and restrictions on unions were removed. What Lige and the Liberals wanted to do was to bring up personal freedoms, economic recovery to the same line, if they could, as the other provinces within Canada. And there was a recognition that, you know, as Quebec kind of remained a little bit in a bubble throughout the 30s right up to the late 50s, there's this desire to kind of catch up. It's not that they were behind economically, it was more, there's just a lot of restrictions, I think, that young people were ready to see a shift in. The government took control of education, so it was removed out of the hands of the Catholic Church, although you can still go to a Catholic school, a private institution, but the public education system was put under control of the government, social services, and added more science and technology to curriculums. French Canadians were happy with the changes toward modernization, but the Roman Catholic Church, RCC, would see its power and influence decrease significantly. And that created a lot of resentment. You know, the Catholic Church, since the Reformation, since Luther's Reformation of 1517, where it starts in Wittenberg when Luther hammers that his 95 Theses, from that point forward, you know, the Catholic Church was dealing with having their power curtailed in one way, shape, or form, and they didn't go down lightly. And, you know, so I think in Quebec, you know, it was a little more muted. It certainly wasn't as difficult as the period of the religious wars, which led to violence and wars and so forth. But there was definitely a real tug and pull. You know, the Roman Catholic Church didn't want to let go of that responsibility, and to some degree they didn't want to lose that control. So This period of change from 1960 to, the middle 60s is known as the Quiet Revolution, because it wasn't a revolution in the sense of people getting up and breaking windows and overthrowing the government. It was a quiet revolution because change was happening in a democratic, rational, pragmatic way. So they were moving forward. In 1962, the Liberals went further by strengthening Quebec's control of its own economy, like nationalizing several hydro companies and turning them into one powerful provincially owned company, Hydro-Quebec. Okay, nationalization. All that means is when a government, whether in this case provincial, federal, we're talking provincial, takes control of certain industries so that they can assure proper management, but also so that all the profits that were incurred, in this case into the hydroelectric industries, would be filtered back into social services for the people of Quebec. Some argue that certain industries should be government owned and others should be privately owned. Something like hydro, people believe, should be government owned, so that it, hopefully, that profits get filtered back into the system and don't go in one person's pocket in Venezuela or something like that. So, all right. So, despite the great achievements of the 1960s, many French Canadians became angry by what they perceived as injustices at the hands of English-speaking Canadians. Now, once again, I've learned so much about Quebec in the last 20 years since I became a teacher. Even when I studied history in university, I took a little bit of Canadian history in first and second year, but my main area of study was sort of European history from the Enlightenment to the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's kind of my main area, 1789-ish, well before that a little bit, right up to the end of the 20th century. And but when you teach in high school in Canada, of course, Canadian history is central. So it was, of course, a passion for me to dig into all this stuff and begin to really become comfortable with my study and understanding of Canadian history. And what I learned as I began to understand Quebec's history, as we talked about earlier, when it was from a royal colony to fell under British control in 1759, that since that period, and since the entrance of the Loyalists after the American Revolution, there was this sense from the position of Quebec that our culture, language, and way of life is slowly being chipped away at. And we need to do everything to defend that. I completely understand, I like to think I completely understand where Quebec is coming from. The problem is that if you look at Quebec's behavior in the 60s, 70s, and 80s without understanding the historical circumstances that led up to it, people very easily make oversimplified judgments about Quebec. Oh, they always want their own thing. They always want to do this. They want to be a distinct society. They want us all to speak French. I mean, I've heard all the cliches. And, even as a young man, I fell into those trappings in conversations. There's nothing worse than having strong opinions about things that you don't understand. That is one of my pet peeves, that you have to be well informed. There's nothing wrong with having a strong opinion and being comfortable and confident in that opinion, but you have to know, appreciate, and understand what you're talking about, and more importantly, you have to understand both sides of the story. So, so when we get to this kind of thing, this perceived injustice, this is deeply, deeply, deeply historical in French culture. So, why was the national capital overwhelmingly English-speaking? Ottawa. Why were French Canadians seldom holding key cabinet positions, and why were French Canadians not given access to French schools outside of Quebec, while English speakers enjoyed those rights in Quebec? Why could English Canadians come to Quebec and live in English communities and go to English schools and not speak a word of French? But if someone who is French Canadian wanted to go to Winnipeg, well, maybe Winnipeg's a bad example because there was, let's say, Victoria, Vancouver, in the 60s, there might be very, very few options for them to go to French-speaking schools. In fact, I would say it was probably nearly non-existent at that time. So, you know, I would argue that, you know, the French Canadians had a reasonable case to be, you know, a little bit disgruntled about this. For some, the solution was separation of Canada, from Canada rather, and some young radicals joined terrorist groups like the Front de Libération du Québec, the FLQ. And, you know, like any separatist movement, you know, there's always going to be a militant wing and a moderate wing. And the FLQ at this time became quite militant and quite determined to break from Canada. Most French Canadians disapproved of terrorist tactics, but in 1967 the influential Quebec cabinet minister René Lévesque, there he is, I remember René, left the Liberal Party and formed the Parti Quebecois, the PQ Party, Parti Quebecois. Lévesque wanted a peaceful divorce from Canada. Lévesque, in his mind, had already come to the conclusion that the best way forward and to be free of suspicion and paranoia and discomfort and worry about what they were getting and what they weren't from Canada was to simply break free and create their own thing. And, you know, on one level I can see why that might be appealing to the Quebecois or to the French Canadians. But we're going to come back later and talk about why that's not just, it's not as easy as just creating a new map or creating a new border. There's a lot of other variables when it comes to creating a new country. Lester Pearson would become Prime Minister. I believe it was 1964. Lester Pearson would follow John Diefenbaker during the height of the Quiet Revolution and believed that Canada should become officially bilingual. So it was Lester Pearson who made the first sort of overture that, look, we need to be a bilingual nation. And basically what that means is it's the recognition that both French and English are the predominant languages of Canada. Although Canada was, there are a lot of Italian speakers, German speakers, Ukrainian speakers, Russian speakers, hundreds of Aboriginal First Nations languages as well. But bilingual is basically an olive branch to Quebec rather to say, look, you know, we're going to make all our legal documents in French and English. People who work in government have to be bilingual. Your children's Cheerios are going to be, cereal box are going to be in French and English, so on and so forth. So, to make this official, Pearson sought to create a new flag, free of the Union Jack, which ironically kind of angered the French Canadians. I don't think the French Canadians were angered that they would be free of the Union Jack. I think they just didn't want the change. And, you know, so there was a lot of debate about what's this flag going to look like. Hey, why don't we put a fleur-de-lis on it? You know, and long and short, of course, the decision was to create the maple leaf. But a lot of French Canadians didn't like it. The result was the maple leaf, and on February 15th, 1965, it was raised on Parliament Hill, but the French remained bitter and continued to fly the fleur-de-lis. So a lot of French Canadian nationalists are like, we're not even going to acknowledge this darn new flag, and we're just going to raise the fleur-de-lis instead. And the fleur-de-lis, of course, is still a big part of, you see them everywhere when you go to Quebec. So, all right. Trudeau, there he is. 1969, Pierre Trudeau would follow Lester Pearson as Prime Minister in 1968. He passed the Official Languages Act, making Canada an officially bilingual nation, and now all federal government agencies were required to provide services in both languages. Consumer products would also be packaged in both languages. So it's official. We are now bilingual. Many embraced bilingualism, but the farther west you got, the more resistance there was to it. In addition, some French Canadians thought Trudeau had not done enough, and they wanted special status in Confederation. So you can't please everybody all the time. I remember in the 70s when I was young, hearing a lot of sort of ugly stereotypes about Quebec and resentment about having French on our cereal boxes or what's so forth. I, as a kid, as I said earlier, didn't have any preconceived notions or prejudices or or bad feelings about Quebec. I had nothing but curiosity and fascination. And I remember when my American family would come over on my father's side, my grandmother and my uncles and my godparents were all from Washington State. I remember them coming up and being fascinated with this box of cereal that had 2 languages on it. It was a really curious thing for them. But Trudeau said that Quebec is an equal partner, just like everyone else. On October 5th, 1970, members of the terrorist group, the FLQ, kidnapped a British diplomat named James Cross from his home, and both federal and Quebec authorities agreed to many demands, but not the release of FLQ prisoners from jail. As a result, the FLQ kidnapped the Labour Minister Pierre Laporte, and Trudeau declared martial law through the War Measures Act, making membership in the FLQ a crime, made it an illegal organization. Laporte's body was found in the trunk of a car, and 2 months later, Cross was found in a Montreal house alive. He's the British diplomat. So the Canadian was killed, and the British diplomat was found alive. In exchange, the captors were given a passage to Cuba, where they were granted asylum. I hope they speak Spanish. I don't know. I'm surprised that Castro would welcome them, but nonetheless, I think they actually ended up coming back. I don't know. I'd have to look and find out the whole story of what happened to these individuals. So, 25 of the 450 detained during the War Measures Act were charged, and the crisis was now over. So, in Canada's history, this was the only time where we had a form of sort of martial law declared. And, you know, the jury's still out, historians still debate. I have great discussions in my classes about, was it the right thing to do, was it not, could it have been done differently? I mean, hindsight is 20/20. Of course, there's all sorts of things we could have done that maybe have made things different. But at the time, you know, this was a very, very challenging time for Trudeau. And, you know, whether he made the right or wrong decision is up to the historians. You know, it's one of those things where the end result, unfortunately, led to the death of a Canadian, but the crisis, for the most part, was averted. All right, so in 1976, René Lévesque and the Parti Quebecois were voted into power in Quebec with promises of a peaceful referendum to determine Quebec's place in Canada. Quebec had voted in a party with an ultimate goal of separation from Canada. This is really, really significant. 1976, the French Canadians elect in office a party whose primary political platform, amongst other things, economic things of course as well, was to separate from Canada. So what signals is that sending to the rest of the country? That, oh my gosh, you know, Quebec really wants to break, you know? You know, for me, as a Westerner, West Coast Canadian, my gosh, like that would break my heart. I mean, for me, I'm very proud of our Quebec past. I'm very proud of our rich Indigenous First Nations history. I'm very proud of our multicultural society. I mean, Canada was one of the greatest experiments of the modern era. You know, Canada and the United States were the only countries in the world that really had this kind of phenomenon of all these groups coming together, you know, in this grand experiment that we now know as Canada. And, you know, it's remarkable now when we talk about human rights, when we talk about, you know, a distinct society, to refer to Quebec, and we look at what's happening right now as I'm doing this lecture. We are in the midst of not only the COVID-19 pandemic, but also the Black Lives Matter movement, which has just created a whole reawakening and reevaluation. You know, Gone with the Wind is being pulled from streaming services. Certain TV programs are being removed. The Confederate flag is being taken away from NASCAR. It is truly remarkable what is happening. There is a major reckoning, if you will, happening in the United States. And the irony is that I was guilty, as I'm sure many were, of being with the understanding that once the U.S. had made it through the civil rights movement it was all downhill, not downhill, it was all smooth sailing from there. I naively thought that the U.S. had finally come to a place where, yes, of course, racism was there and it existed, but that it wasn't so brutally systemic as it clearly is, not only in police forces, but in government, in Hollywood, and so on and so on and so forth. So very, very interesting things happening in the States right now. And you can really kind of draw a parallel between, and I'm only comparing from a perspective of being heard, if you will, between the Black Lives Matter movement of African Americans and the Quebecois saying, hey, you know, we've been discriminated against for years, we've been marginalized, and this is what we want, and so on and so forth. So, very interesting connection between those two things. First step was passing Bill 101, making French the only official language in Quebec. Now, some would say this is where they maybe went just a tad too far. Are you saying that there's no English-speaking schools? Is English no longer a language that will be used in legal documents or federal or provincial documents for that matter? Will Cheerios now only be in French, and so on and so on and so forth? So it was a pretty bold move, this Bill 101. All government employees had to speak in French, and all visible signs had to be in French. Children of immigrants were required to attend French rather than English schools. So if you immigrated to Quebec, you'd have to be prepared to learn French. Now, for many, that wasn't a problem. They were just very happy to be in Canada, especially if they were fleeing hardship and war and chaos. Whether it was French or English that they learned, maybe didn't matter to them. They were just happy to be here. English Canadians in Quebec felt threatened, and they looked to the federal government for support. These are the English Canadians in Quebec. In 1980, a referendum was held. Lévesque pleading French Canadians to vote a new association with Canada based on their sovereignty, based on the Sovereignty Association rather, and Trudeau making an equally impassioned speech to remain part of a forward-looking unified Canada with promises of a new constitution should the no side win. So a lot of the motivating factors for Pierre Trudeau to implement and put forward the idea of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was instigated by this concern of trying to create a constitution that was more inclusive and more equal, and so on and so forth. And the irony, of course, of it is that when the Charter of Rights and Freedoms passes and we get consent from Great Britain and we are now completely independent and we have our own constitution, Quebec doesn't sign. So it's interesting. The no side won 60-40, and Lévesque had to accept defeat. Trudeau would have to follow through on his promises to the Quebecois. So 60% of the French Canadians in 1980 said, we're not ready to split. Let's see what Trudeau comes up with. I'm sure many were curious in the constitutional debates that were already beginning to happen. So true to his promise, Trudeau wanted to bring the British North America Act of 1867 under British jurisdiction home to Canada. First step was to establish an amending formula which would determine how many provinces would have to be in agreement for a change in the Constitution. Okay, holy mackerel, well, when you change a Constitution, you can't just do it. You have to make sure that there is a formula, in this case an amending formula in place, where all the provinces and territories of Canada agree that 75% have to support it in order for it to pass. Whatever that consensus is, has to be reached by all, right? So that in itself is going to be complex and amending formula. The provinces supported the charter with a notwithstanding clause, allowing the federal or provincial governments to opt out of some of the clauses in the charter. So if you've got, and I'm just going to say, 20 points in the charter, if BC didn't really want to adopt point 8 and point 12, we would have the freedom and the legal right to opt out of certain clauses. which sounds problematic, but it was a way of kind of roping in everybody to not make them feel like they were being strangleheld and told this is how it's going to be and this is what you have to abide by. It gave a little bit of wiggle room for each province to determine what aspects of the charter was most important for provincial desires and needs. L'évêque felt the charter did not identify Quebec as a distinct society, and as a result, Quebec did not sign the charter. And even today, Quebec has their own constitution, which is kind of a little bit of the British North America Act, a whole bunch of the old Napoleonic Code, but they do not go by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's very interesting. You've got a province within Canada which has their own constitution, separate from the federal constitution. So it's very interesting. April 1982, the act was signed by Trudeau and Queen Elizabeth outside Parliament in Ottawa. There they are here, 1982, and it was right around this time, it must have been when she was here to sign this document, that she did a little bit of a tour. And when I was 15, I was in grade 9 at the time, they canceled the afternoon so that all of us could jump on the bus and go downtown and greet Queen Elizabeth in the Inner Harbour in Victoria, BC here, and we all waved at her. And you know, I even think she may have been wearing that suit. But anyway, so I can honestly say that I've seen the Queen. Exciting stuff. Canada celebrated, but few Quebec flew flags at half-mast. And L'évêque led an angry demonstration through the streets of Quebec. So there was this sort of eruption of frustration and anger by Quebec by the, you know, this Charter of Rights and Freedoms. They're trying to impose this on us and they're not letting us do our own thing. And once again, we have to be careful because, you know, Quebec is reacting to years and years of what they feel were marginalization. So before the knee-jerk reaction is to be critical. I always believe, and I will say this over and over and over again, that in order to understand someone, you got to stand in their shoes and walk around in them. Atticus Finch from To Kill a Mockingbird said that, and I've used this quote in many of my lectures because it's remarkable how relevant it is in so many different circumstances, that it's too easy from a Western perspective to make a rush judgment about Quebec's behavior through my lens. I've got to understand it through their lens, and then I'll be more empathetic and less critical. So, all right, 1984 election campaign. Brian Mulroney promised to repair the damage of 1982 by obtaining Quebec's consent to the Constitution with honor and enthusiasm. You know, Mulroney, who would replace Trudeau in 1984, yes, 1984, really wanted to make this Constitution work with all Canadians. So, when L'évêque retired, the pro-federalist Liberal Party took office with Robert Bourassa. Here he is here. Mulroney began negotiations. However, opening this debate just brought other concerns from Alberta and Newfoundland, who wanted greater control of their resources. So when you begin to have conversations about compromise, okay, look, we will do this for you. Then others are going to be saying, wait a second here, if you are willing to bend the rules for them, why can't you bend the rules for us? Because we have regional concerns and needs, just as Quebec does. They may be completely different, but if you're going to bend the rules for them, we want you bending the rules for us. It's a can of worms that I think is very difficult to contain once you've opened it up. And that's where the Meech Lake Accord, we'll talk about shortly, became problematic. With continuing Western alienation, the Reform Party is formed in 1987. There he is there. Preston Manning was his name. He was going to be the populist leader who was going to resurrect the values of Western, the Western rural community and sort of a populist old social credit mentality. He was sort of a natural reaction to this sense in the West. When we're talking about West, we're talking largely about BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and I guess Manitoba as well, that they make all the decisions over there in the East, and they do everything for themselves, and they don't even really listen to what we have to say out here in the West. But it's not entirely untrue, or it's not entirely true, but there is that perception in the West that somehow we're getting the short end of the stick, so to speak. 1987, Mulroney called the premiers to a conference at Meech Lake where he proposed a package of amendments to the Constitution. He's got a plan. But like I say, when you're talking amendments, where does it end, right? And that results in Meech Lake. Among other provisions, the Meech Lake Accord, MLA, doesn't mean, in this case, doesn't mean a member of Legislative Assembly, offered to recognize Quebec as a distinct society and proposed giving more power to other provinces in Canada. Okay, so if you're going to do that for them, this is what you got to do for us, right? So it wasn't just that we're going to give Quebec distinct society status. We're going to allow the other provinces to have special provisions as well, if you will. Trudeau, now out of office, argued that this designation would create two solitudes, the designation of a distinct society, by making them less part of a collective experience. By building a distinct society, you are separating them. So it's kind of counterintuitive, if you will. So many Westerners did not like this distinct society clause, and First Nations asked, are we too not a distinct society? Holy mackerel. Of course they are. Oh my gosh, but now you see where we're going here, right? You have made promises to one group, and then it's a domino effect, right? Then everybody wants their own amendments and their own provisions within the Constitution. Others argued that Canadians did not have enough time to process and participate in these monumental changes. Manitoba and Newfoundland withheld their support, and the MLA, that is the Meech Lake Accord, disintegrated in June 1990. The Meech Lake Accord was very well intentioned. No question about that. The problem with the Meech Lake Accord is it made too many promises to too many people, and everything fell apart. Because you get a room full of people, yeah, this is what I was promised this, but I want that. You promised this, they got that, we want this. You can see the problem, right? So Quebecers felt humiliated, and by late 1990, 64% favored separation. So the Meech Lake Accord contributed to this sense of, oh, we've been wronged again, we asked to be a distinct society, we have now been turned away. When in reality, the only reason it was turned away was because nobody could come to an agreement on any of the provisions of the Meech Lake Accord. So, Lucien Bouchard, a powerful member of Mulroney's cabinet, resigned in protest and formed the Parti Quebecois. The separation debate was renewed. So, here we go again, right? And that's the thing with the separation debate, is it tends to ebb and flow and go like this. So. All right, Mulroney continued the debate, and to avoid previous mistakes, his government set up a citizens forum, a committee that traveled across Canada to hear views from Canadians on the future of the Constitution, the Charlottetown Accord. So you are now putting it to the hands of the people. Well, how are you going to collate that information? It's a very noble thing to do, you know. Let everyone fill out a piece of paper. This is my suggestion. Well, who's going to read all that? Who's going to tabulate all that information, right? It was a way, as I say, of trying to show that we're going to put it in the hands of the Canadian people. Mulroney proposed reforming the Senate by making it an elected body, still a huge debate in Canadian politics today, with equal representation from all provinces. It also addressed and supported Aboriginal self-government to draw support from First Nations. Self-government we're going to talk quite a bit about in my next lecture. Continues to be a huge discussion. 54.5% of voters rejected it, as the Charlottetown Accord had so many clauses. BC made the greatest opposition, as the clause which gave Quebec 25% of the seats in the House of Commons, regardless of its size of population, angered them. This reminds me so much of the Acerbo law in Italy, you know, where you're guaranteeing that whichever party comes into power, even if they only get 40% of the vote, they get 66% of the seats. Now this wasn't nearly, the Acerbo law was different because you're talking about the popular vote, you're talking about the majority of seats. But in this case, people were saying, wait a second here, they're guaranteed 25% of the seats in the House of Commons regardless, right? This was an attempt at an olive branch, right? Trying to quell some of the anger and frustration from French Canadians by sort of offering this carrot, if you will, right? And so naturally, by making this proposal, British Columbians are like, we don't like that. Quebecers protested that most Senate seats were given up to the West, which was true at that time. In addition, Quebec feared Aboriginal self-government because it would affect a large portion of northern Quebec. So northern Quebec had a lot to lose if the Indigenous peoples were going to do their own thing as well. Maybe that's something that Quebec hadn't been thinking about before the discussion about Aboriginal self-government became a real hot topic at this time. All right, angered by these debates, Quebec elected the separatist Parti Quebecois again in 1994. A referendum was held while Canada held its breath, and astonishingly, 49.4% voted yes, 50.6% said no. I am still dumbstruck. I will never forget hearing this at the time, and I thought it could not have come any closer. I mean, what was the shortest margin? 50.9, 40. I mean, it's just unbelievable, you know, how close this was. By the end of the century, no solution was clear, and when Jean Chrétien became Prime Minister, he said that should Quebec ever seek sovereignty, the cost would be high. Here's the thing that I think maybe certain elements of the separatist movement were considering. When you break from Canada, you are all of a sudden responsible to create your own military, your own navy, your own currency, your own foreign policy, your own trade relationships, your own social safety net and bureaucratic system. It is a huge undertaking. It is not just a matter of simply creating a new border. So I think Chrétien was right that, look guys, if you really want to go, you have to realize there is a lot at stake. Not just about losing out from Canada, but what you're going to have to do to get started. So by 2000, the move towards separation was waning in Quebec, and more recent leadership have sought a restructuring of Canadian Confederation into something resembling more like the European Union. So, you know, since the end of the 20th century, there hasn't been quite the broad vocal call out towards sovereignty, if you will. The elements are still there, of course, but it's really kind of subsided that kind of situation. So, all right, so that being said, we're going to leave it at that. And thank you very much for watching. Next lecture, as I said, is going to deal with Canada's relationship with multiculturalism, or how multiculturalism functions in Canada. And also we're going to look at First Peoples, First Nations in Canada as well. So thank you very much. We'll see you next time.